Oh boy, do I have a video for you guys. Folks, this is Fernando doing another video for the Modern Survivalist. You asked for it, you have it. This is Javier Milei. This will be the next president of Argentina, libertarian, being interviewed by no other than Tucker Carlson. So, what is this about? Well, it is the most watched This beat Trump. This beat Tucker Carlson's interview with Trump. It has more views than that. It was shared by Elon Musk, and it's been all over the place. And there's several things to learn from this. So stick around. I'll make a few important points. I'll explain a few things about this man who is apparently coming out of nowhere. And yeah, you definitely want to stay for this one. Before I go on, again, as always, if you want to learn more about survival and preparedness, especially a practical aspect of it, street survival skills, lots of sketches, drawings, and explanations, and practical skills, especially in terms of self-defense, you want to develop, and surviving the economic collapse, given the times we are currently living in and the times that are ahead of us, you want to get those two books and read them as soon as you can. So, who is Javier Milei? Dear God. Okay, Javier Milei is an interesting character with his crazy hair and his piercing blue eyes coming out of nowhere in Argentina. Look, he is an economist, he is a libertarian, even though he now calls himself a liberal, which is stupid if you ask me, because liberal, we know, this is like using a rainbow flag and calling yourself gay because you're a happy person. No, those things have a certain language that we understand these days that are not what they were like 50 years ago. You're not a happy people. You're not a happy person. You're just someone that is attracted to someone of your same sex. That's the way language has gone. Now trying to impose this, I'm a liberal. No, you're a libertarian. Stop calling yourself a liberal. You're confusing people, Javier Milei. But yeah, a libertarian, right? And let's listen to Tucker Carlson himself.
For a long time. This is now a desperate country. Its economy is in shambles, has been for a long time. Argentina famously defaulted on its debt more than 20 years ago. But now hyperinflation has made the...
That's why I wrote this book, that the defaulting of the national debt ended up in the collapse of the entire country. That's why I wrote that and explained in that book over there.
Genuinely desperate. You see, when you have dinner here in restaurants and people pull out bricks of local currency, the peso, to pay, it feels like Weimar or Zimbabwe, but it's not. This is a developed country that's moving backwards at high speed. And because of the frustration that has built up among the population, particularly among poor people, a man called Javier Milei is poised to become its next president. He's a former soccer star, a goalie, a performer in a Rolling Stones cover band, and a libertarian economist. He's not a libertarian in the traditional American sense. He wouldn't fit into the Cato Institute, which has attacked him for liking Donald Trump too much. He's a libertarian in the traditional sense. He believes people should have the maximum amount of freedom they can be given, which is a lot, much more than they now get in Argentina. He has moved from basically nowhere in the last several years to become maybe the most famous person in this country. The election is next month in October, and once again, it seems like he's likely to win.
Yeah.
The reception he's gotten from the press in the West, particularly in the United States.
Now, a few things here, and this is important. Javier Milei is not a football star. What you guys call soccer, the rest of the world calls football. Javier Milei is not a football star. Lionel Messi is a football star. He's actually the greatest football player that ever lived. But even with, you have to understand Argentina is different in terms of sport. You couldn't possibly understand how important football is in Argentina. It's more important than the president, than any president. It's more important than Javier Milei. It's more important than anything else. It is the thing that we have in the country that we can take pride of. Current world champions. You don't mess around with football in Argentina because it is not about being a fan of a sport. It is a way of life. And calling someone a football star in Argentina, it is a big deal. There's not many football stars in the world for our standards. And Javier Milei is not even a football player. Professional. A football player in Argentina is someone that gets paid to play football professionally. Javier Milei never played professionally for anyone. He barely played as a goalie for whatever little local, whatever division team. but he's not he's not in any way a football star. Just by looking at it, you can pretty much tell that right away. He's not athletic. He never was. But, just a little detail, but it just goes to show how whatever you're listening to, just take everything with a huge grain of salt, because sometimes it is simply untrue and not correct. Just a little detail, but it goes to show what I'm trying to explain here.
Natural resources, intelligent, well-educated population, and yet its economy is in shambles. So clearly the system isn't working. How could anyone support that?
A ver, el problema es que Argentina empezó a abrazar las ideas socialistas hace más de 100 años y siempre es buena la analogía o la metáfora de el sapo en el agua.
You know where this is going. The frog in the pot of water boiling slowly. Yes, and he is absolutely correct. It's actually more like 80 years, but yeah, we could go with 100 years if you want, but it's been a very long time that Argentina has slowly embraced socialism more and more. Socialism, and not a Nordic country kind of socialism where, oh no, it's about free access to schools, or, no, socialism as Cuba, as Russia, as China, that kind of socialism, not a social welfare state kind of thing where at some point you could say, oh yeah, we want to have certain things for it. No, you're talking about hardcore commie activity, which ended up in what was called the Dirty War. You actually had a military force fighting terrorists, communist terrorists within the country itself. So it was a big deal in Argentina fighting communism. It actually is the reason why we ended up with a military junta and all of the problems we saw. It's not exclusive to Argentina. You saw this in our countries across Latin America and in Europe as well. In Spain, you also had a guy who was fighting a communist uprising in the form of Franco, who was also very unpopular, especially more now than ever. But the history books often don't do justice to what was on the other side. What is it that these people were fighting against? They were fighting against ending up like Cuba. So as bad as any military dictatorship is, you could argue very well that it was much better than ending up in a communist revolution winning. That's what happens in Cuba. You don't want that. You don't want to end up like Cuba. That's the worst possible outcome you can have, even though a military dictatorship is no walk in the park. Okay?
Y entonces uno empieza a calentar el agua y el sapo no se da cuenta.
And he's correct. And so it goes. Now, he does make a great point about socialism being, the greatest problem Argentina has dealt with in its different forms. Because every country has its own idiocracy in terms of how it presents, the package of how you try to sell communism and socialism and these Soviet ideas. At times, currently, Argentina and the rest of South America is strongly influenced by Russia and China, especially Russia. The Soviet influence, like in RT News, the Russian TV network, having a Spanish version for Latin America dedicated so as to spread its own propaganda, and it's quite effective at that. In terms of gender ideology, he makes a great case about, things you already know about how the gender pay gap is no such thing. It doesn't exist. It's simply a matter of adjusting by the kind of work women and men do. The difference in terms of, yes, as far as biology goes, only women can get pregnant, men don't get pregnant, men don't carry children, therefore they can spend more time doing their job, they can have a further dedication to their careers. It's also the case that men do more dangerous and better paying jobs than women. It doesn't change the fact that many women get paid very, very well. Many women doctors, many women CEOs. It's often the case that women get placed in positions of better command chain within the company simply because they are women and they want to raise that flag of social justice. We have a woman now that's CEO, when in fact she was not even well qualified for that, but simply because she was a woman she gets the extra vote and ends up with that with that job. In terms of abortion, he explains very well how, as a libertarian, you cannot be for abortion. Oh, I'm pro-choice. No. If you're a libertarian and your political agenda revolves around raising freedom and liberty above everything else as your core value, and you want to have a small, effective government that does the things that government is supposed to do, administrating certain things, so as to have a functioning society while at the same time not meddling in the private life of its citizens, would you agree with me or not? That is the ideal version of what a government is supposed to be for us libertarians, for us that truly believe in freedom as the core fundamental value in our lives, and the same fundamental value that should be shared by politicians that share our views. Okay, then you cannot be in favor of, you cannot support abortion, because you're going against the core right of the individual, which is the right to live. And especially with the most vulnerable of them all. I am 100% in favor of a government looking after the most vulnerable of them all, the ones that are least likely to be able to defend themselves. I want a government that has fair laws, right, and respects those laws and has ways of enforcing those when necessary, right? And I understand that I have as much right to live in freedom and safety as anyone else in civilized society, but I also understand that I'm not as vulnerable as a 5-year-old child. The smaller and younger you are, the more vulnerable you are as well. And the youngest and most vulnerable of them all is the one that is still living inside the womb of the person that is his mother. You are the most vulnerable position possible because you're the smallest, tiniest version of yourself that you'll ever be, and you're inside the body of someone else. So when they're talking about the rights of my body, my choice, that is no longer your body. That is another body that in 99% of the chances it was consenting relationship that brought that person to life, and all of a sudden you think you have the right to end you think you have the right to end the life that is now inside of you because of your own choices. That's not how libertarians should work. If freedom and liberty and the right to live is your fundamental value, that little tiny guy or girl has as much right to live as you do, being the grown adult that you are. Not because you're tiny or small should you have less of a right to live. And Javier Milei explains that quite nicely in the interview.
Así que lo voy a decir como libertario. Nosotros creemos que el liberalismo es el respeto irrestricto del proyecto de vida del prójimo, basado en el principio de no agresión y en defensa del derecho a la vida, a la libertad y a la propiedad. Por lo tanto, adhiriendo a las ideas de la libertad, básicamente una de las ideas fundamentales es defender el derecho a la vida. O sea, filosóficamente estoy a favor de respetar el derecho a la vida.
And there he goes. Then he talks about commie Pope Francis. How is it that you feel about commie Pope? And again, Javier Milei is correct. He has a position that he cannot agree with commie Pope. Even though commie Pope is a fellow Argentine, he's still a commie. And we don't like commies. We cannot agree with commies if we claim to be libertarians. Communism and socialism and the left is the opposite of freedom, liberty, and the essence of what a human being is. And that's why communism can never possibly work, because it goes against nature, against human nature specifically. Communism and socialism, no matter what variant you want to look at, if it's the Soviet variant, if it's the Chinese variant, if it's the corporate communism and socialism that large corporations like to abuse and take advantage of and use that as a way of milking people from their hard-earned money and their freedom and their rights. Doesn't matter what it is, it goes against nature. It is the idea of you being just another cog in the machine, you being like an ant or a little bee in a beehive, and you're not an individual. You're not capable of rising above the others. You're not a creative person that can bring added value to whatever you do because of your individual capabilities. This goes against communism at its core, okay?
Después hay una justificación.
And he makes a great point about how Pope Francis is actually more of a political activist. one of these ideologies of certain priests that were liberation ideology, associating freedom and prosperity and being sympathetic to the struggles of those that are poor because of the oppression of the rich and the capitalists, right? So it's a commie interpretation of religion. Basically, that's what Pope Francis believes in, and it just doesn't align with the rest of us. Then they talk a little bit about architecture, which, is something that obviously something that Tucker Carlson observed, and he noticed
que genera tanta fascinación y que es deslumbrante, porque es la arquitectura de la Argentina gloriosa, de la Argentina liberal. El mejor ejemplo de ello es el Teatro Colón.
Anyway, he starts talking about, Tucker Carlson brings up that Buenos Aires is a mix of things, and some buildings are beautiful and glorious, and some others are dark and ugly. And yes, it is true that those are the ugliest, worst, most depressing buildings are of the socialist variant. It's actually, it's a social, it's a social a language that permeated into architecture. I don't know how it's in English, but it's the brutalist architecture. The brutal architecture originates in UK, 1950s, post-war, and those were the first socialist built buildings. They were ugly, square, blocks of concrete. They had no soul. They were ugly as hell. They were just filling a function. It's a box to put a person or put a government employee in, and that's it. And those ugly commie buildings, they eventually formed their own commie, ugly architectural language, which is interesting. And he noticed that, and yes, there is a point. And yes, it is true that from that point on, it became somewhat of a language that goes beyond the politics of socialism, and many architects embrace the idea of brutalist architecture. But originally, yes, it is a commie type of building because it's ugly as hell, it's cheap to build, and it has no soul and no grace and no distinction from anything else. Okay, enough about architecture and brutalist architecture. Let's go into advice for Mr. Donald Trump. And I don't know if it's much of a great part.
Se dejen seducir.
Never let yourself be seduced by the song of the sirens,
de la justicia social.
Social justice.
Que no se dejen atrapar por esa frase nefasta que donde hay una ansiedad nace un derecho, pero que eso no se hace solo. Para eso hay que estar preparado y hay que dar la batalla cultural día a día.
Anyway, that's basically his advice for Donald Trump. I don't know why Javier Milei would be giving advice, but that's what he was asked, and that's what he was explaining. This is what Tucker Carlson asked him. Then he goes into climate change. Do you believe in climate change? Of course not. And he identifies correctly, Javier Milei correctly identifies as the climate change, which, keep in mind, climate change is real in terms that climate is always changing. That is very much correct. These are the little traps from the left. Climate is changing all the time. It has been changing for millions of years. It's always been the case. We've gone through a number of glacier eras, and there's been times in which the world has been warmer and colder, and these things happen naturally. The idea of man-caused climate change, that is the cultural Marxist lie. It is not true. There's no science backing any of that. It simply couldn't be proven ever because it's most likely not real. There's no science that shows that men in any way could possibly change the weather of the entire freaking planet. It is stupid to even think about it, but even more so, there's no evidence supporting that. Anytime you ask for such evidence, they start pulling numbers randomly that make no sense and prove absolutely nothing. It's not all that complicated to read and understand basic papers on these things, and when you start reading, you quickly, even if you're not an expert on these fields, you quickly smell the bullshit because it just makes no sense. The idea that you using an electric car is saving the world, it is commie garbage. It is cultural Marxist agenda. And and he correctly identifies it as such. Now, what is even more interesting is that he explains that this is based on the failures of communism from the time in which the wall was not, the fall of the wall? No, from the moment in which the wall was first built. That is the moment in which communism showed how much of a failure it is as a form of life, as a political movement, as a form of government. Communism and socialism and the left, the global left, is simply against human nature and the idea of people being capable of excelling on their own merit, and people being different, people being capable of great achievements due to their own effort, either individually or collectively with those that they choose to associate with. All of that goes against the teachings of communism, in which you're just a little ant, a little animal that is incapable of knowing what's good for you, and you simply need to obey. That's why people don't flee from capitalist governments, from countries in the West with all of the problems that Western society has. You don't see people leaving Western Europe moving towards Russia. You see the opposite. You don't see people swimming from United States to Cuba or crossing over illegally to Mexico. You don't see that happen. You see the opposite. So in spite of all the problems that many of our nations have, communism is always worse. Russia is always worse. Putin is always worse. China is always worse. North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, it's all the same pile of garbage. Never forget that, because if it wasn't, people would be going in the opposite direction. Does that make any sense? I think it does. Anytime one of these commie bastards, embracing the ideas of being a conservative, I'm a right wing. No. If you're embracing communism, if you try to make me believe that the Soviet Union was great at any moment, at any point, and it should come back, we are talking about very different things, and I definitely don't agree with that. Anyway, given the failures of communism and socialism, the idea was to reinvent itself as something of a moral compass. So we fail in terms of society, governments, and the economy, but we have the moral upper hand. We are looking after the rights of the poor, oppressed. We're looking after the women's rights. We're looking after the rights of black people oppressed by the evil whites. We're trying to save the planet from you greedy people that want to contaminate and spoil Mother Earth. So they reinvent themselves. They put this cloak on themselves as a higher moral standard than the rest of us. And it is all encompassing. You have to agree with everything. You have to agree with that and their commie agenda. And that's the point in which it becomes almost like a cult or a religion, where you have to be aligned 100% with the message, okay? And that's how it reinvents themselves, and that's how we end up with this insanity of climate change, and how cows farting and you eating meat is the cause for warm summers, which is stupid, but it is what it is. China. I actually like this part right here.
De hecho, no solo no voy a hacer negocios con China.
You've said that as president of Argentina, you will not do...
Pay it, guys. Final point. Pay attention. Listen to Tucker Carlson. Listen to Javier Milei.
You've said that as president of Argentina, you will not do business with China.
De hecho, no solo no voy a hacer negocios con China. No voy a hacer negocios con ningún comunista. Es decir, a ver, yo soy un defensor de la libertad, de la paz y de la democracia. Los comunistas no entran ahí. Los chinos no entran ahí. Putin no entra ahí.
¡Oh!
Digamos, Lula no entra ahí. Es decir, nosotros queremos ser el faro moral del continente. Nosotros queremos ser los defensores de la libertad, de la democracia, de la diversidad, de la paz. Entonces, nosotros desde el Estado no vamos a promover ningún tipo de acción con comunistas, ni socialistas.
There you go. And this is what I like about Javier Milei the most. He has a very clear, at least when he's talking, what I'm hearing from him, actions will say if he follows through or not, which it's a big question mark. I hope he does. He will most likely become president of Argentina. People are very much backing him 100%. He will be the next president. Will he actually go through with this? Will he not go to bed with China, with Russia, with the rest of the commies like Putin, that this guy asking him the questions seems to favor so much? There you go, right? Did you listen to that, Tucker? No, Putin is not freedom. Putin is not liberty. Putin is not conservative. He's not the right. He's the left. He's a commie. He's a Soviet piece of shit. That's what we understand so well. That's what so many people in the United States don't understand. They think, oh no, but he's conservative. Fernando, you don't understand. Putin is conservative. He's against the gays. You know who was also against gays? Che Guevara wanted to execute them all. Try being gay right now in China, in North Korea, or in Russia. Those are the places. And what is? Oh, but we are aligned with? No. That is because they are against freedom and liberty. And it also includes the idea of anything that weakens their great push forward, their great revolution, their great communist leaders. Anything that goes against their agenda, which is a weakness, they just cut from the base. They just get rid of. That's why Che Guevara was against them. But it's not because of them having any moral values of any kind. They have none. They just see it as a weakness. They just see it as something that goes against their own plans, their own ambitions. But Javier Milei explained that very clearly. And Tucker Carlson, he said nothing. He didn't go out defending his pal Putin. He didn't go out defending Russia. And I love that. Nice. It's nice to see a nice change instead of so much Russian propaganda being spread all the time. But going to the point of this interview, Javier Milei understands that. And I really appreciate that. I hope he follows through. I hope he doesn't align with any commie, with any socialist, right? When he's asked about Trump and some of the corporations that Trump clearly benefited, Pfizer, when Fauci was just standing next to him, when Warp Speed and all of this stuff we know of, who was being benefited? The largest corporations, the same ones that promote the socialist agenda because it always benefits them, because it's socialist when it comes to taking money out of your pocket. It's suddenly capitalist when it comes into putting that same money into their own private bank accounts, right? No, you have to decide. You cannot go both ways. Either you're against communism and socialism or you're not. Either you're in favor of freedom, liberty, and what Javier Milei just explained, or you're not. You cannot have both ways. You cannot be in favor of Putin and Russia and the Soviet Union and be in favor of freedom and liberty and capitalism and humans going after their own way of life and enjoying a government that does not meddle, that does not oppress them, that does not tell them how they should be living, right? That is the opposite of what you have in these dictatorships from China, from Russia, from the rest of the commie scum. We don't want that. And hopefully Javier Milei will do just that. Is he, there's lots of things that I question about Javier Milei. There's things he had said and then gone back on. So I'm not a Javier Milei fanboy anymore than I was ever a Tucker Carlson fanboy or a Trump fanboy or any of that. I've gone through all of this so many times before that I know better than that. I'm not making the same mistake. If he does what he says he's going to be doing later, great. I hope he does it. I hope Argentina does great. It will not happen overnight. I know that that's impossible. You don't fix a country like Argentina in just one term. We've tried that with Macri, didn't work. And people did not understand the kind of effort that was needed. Guys, this is my take on Javier Milei. This is my analysis on the Tucker Carlson interview. I hope you gained something from this, at least different perspectives, maybe understanding this man a little bit better, who will likely be next president in a country that, as small or big influence as it has in the region, it will matter. Guys, see you next time. Take care.